Monsters. They take on many forms and populate the horror genre, whether as a bloodthirsty succubus, howling lichen, a cursed individual, possessed doll, undead beings, a demonic presence, a living nightmare, and hell, even your own family. However, just because one is identified as a monster doesn't mean they are the enemy. Monsters can be more than just the embodiments of what we fear, but they can also be seen as our protector, a spiritual guide into the unknown, a manifestation of our emotions, or just a natural form of life. The horror genre is arguably the best when it comes to contextualizing a monster's actions by how they, or it, affect the characters of the specific narrative, as well as how the audience reacts, and how the monster represents more than just a frightening persona. So, what is it about the horror genre that brings out what audiences enjoy about the monster? Well, according to Noel Carroll, the author of The Philosophy of Horror of Paradoxes of the Heart, it's a connection with the character's emotive evaluations of the monster that determine the various emotions in the presence of an abnormality, which in turn causes that relevant sensation in us when watching horror. A monster like Pennywise the Dancing Clown comes to mind when it comes to experiencing various emotions in horror. The reason being is because Pennywise is an unidentified creature in disguise that finds pleasure in feeding on the fears of children. The characterization of Pennywise is quite disturbing to say the least, with moments that would give one a cold shoulder when they see a red balloon passing by, as well as moments where one finds themselves intrigued by Pennywise's actions and how he goes about terrorizing the Losers Club by embodying what they fear the most, who ultimately come together to face their fears and cherish this moment for the rest of their lives, the same way audiences would cherish the thrills of going to see a good horror film. Now if we take a step back into the past of the film Nosferatu, yes, that Nosferatu, the film set the stage for the monster to have an interpersonal connection / obsession with the damsel in distress. Film theorist Laura Mulvey theorizes that a monster's lust for the damsel's representation of the patriarchal order in its Illusionistic narrative form, through the images of the woman being portrayed as a passive erotic object for the gaze of her admirer, who so happens to be a bloodthirsty vampire. In 1932, we have the release of The Mummy. The quote-unquote monster known as Imhotep can coincide with the scholar Gayarachi Spivak's ideology of knowledge never being innocent, and a prime example of conquering another's culture by fantasizing what is not intended to be. During the golden age of horror, Hollywood, particularly Universal Studios, took advantage of foreign cultures by shaping them into cultural metaphors that continue to be relevant to this very day, and skew audiences' perception of foreign cultures, for better or for worse. In 1978, we have the release of John Carpenter's Halloween, which hinders on the climax between the final girl and the monster during the pinnacle of slasher films. Film professor Carol Clover presented an interesting view on slashers by stating that the killer, more specifically male killers, sorry Pamela, are used in a way that suggests they are sexually oppressed. Their lust for death stems from their masculinity being compromised, as well as wear a mask due to the loss of identity, and use a sharp tool to kill their victims as a surrogate for sexual / gender inadequacy, while the final girl serves as the vehicle for male viewers to latch onto, the desire to have the purest woman imaginable, but ultimately falls short of the mark. Moving into the 21st century of horror, we have the sleeper hit Get Out, where we have the Armitage family portrayed as a black man's worst nightmare. Author Robin R. Coleman's take on black characters in horror films connects heavily with black men leads seeking redemption from their oppressor. In this case, Chris Washington fighting back against the Armitages from using his strong youthful body as a replacement for their old weak one. Also seeing that Chris is the first African American lead character in a horror film of the 2010s era, this could influence more horror films to dive deep into the domestic space of black culture. When focusing on other domestic spaces, The Babadook presents the worst moments of being a single parent as a woman. Senior lecturer Bridget Cherry studies on the intertwined dynamic of the monster's gaze of the female subject, which promotes an intriguing perspective on how female horror film viewers engage with the genre. With female director Jennifer Kent at the helm, immediately the relationship of the power dynamic between the monster and the female subject has shifted into more of an internal conflict with oneself of how to cope with loss and the struggle of hiding that pain, even though one day you may have to revisit that pain again. Back in the early 2000s with films like Saw, audiences were flocking to the theater to see the many ways humans can get dismembered. Oddly enough, Tania Milewski's The Terror Pleasure Study may provide the right answers. As in most horror films, there's always the villain and the victims, with Milewski stating that if both sides are portrayed as shadowy and underdeveloped characters, the audience will cease to care for their demise. Case in point with Jigsaw, who views his act of terror justifiable towards his victims as they have done wrong by him or others in the past, which ultimately makes the pain of watching one suffer easier to watch. If you're into that sort of thing. Criticized by audiences for being falsely marketed as a traditional horror film, Crimson Peak presents some of the best of the modern neo-gothic subgenre has to offer. As author Edwina Keown states, Crimson Peak positions itself as a traditional neo-gothic film from the start and takes influences of the classic gothic literacy displayed throughout. The twist of Thomas and Lucille being revealed as the true monsters instead of the ghosts that haunt the mansion present a visually stunning display of Crimson Peak being tainted by the blood of their victims. In The Witch, a family in the 1630s New England is torn apart by witchcraft and possession, which present a modern example of the monster as feminine. Now when I say monster is feminine, I don't mean a female monster wanting to swallow one's soul.
Hey, I'll swallow your soul! I'll swallow your soul! I'll swallow your soul!
Swallow this.
Professor of Cinema Studies Barbara Creed states that the monster as feminine represents the importance of gender in the form of a woman's monstrosity. A biological freak whose body is meant to be feared and threatening from a sexual point of view. Case in point, when Caleb sees the witch for the first time, he is stunned by her beauty, and thus suffers the consequences moments after the encounter. Lastly, we have Raw, a French horror film that is a twisted coming-of-age story of a young woman finding pleasure in consuming human flesh. The actions of the lead girl Justine slowly becoming this flesh-craving monster fits in well with Janice Lorax's research on violent women in contemporary cinema, stating that the extremely violent acts of a woman on screen tend to have a metaphorical meaning of the woman's experiences in a culture that has repressed her true self and molded into something that she is not. Thus complements Justine's arc from being your run-of-the-mill vegetarian to a flesh-eating cannibal. This concludes the Gallery of Horror, where we have delved deep into the psyche and theories behind the various monsters. If you enjoyed this video and you want to add anything to the discussion, please leave your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching.